Welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to hear from Dr. Rob McKenna. Rob is the CEO of Wild Leaders and renowned expert in leadership development. He's celebrated for his groundbreaking work in fostering trust, driving performance, and connecting business strategy with the human side of leadership. He's ranked among the top 30 most influential IO psychologists alive today, and he has over 2 decades of research and practical experience that position him as a thought leader in crafting sustainable, people-centered organizations. His innovative methods bridge the divide between strategic business goals and the emotional and relational needs of leaders, teams, and individuals, creating thriving cultures that deliver results. Today, we get to hear about the sacred trade-off, 10 keys to sacrifice, self-preservation, and leadership wholeness.
Sacrifice is such a controversial topic to talk about with the necessary depth to make it meaningful and real to our experience. But sacrifice plays a role in our organizational lives every day. And in fact, facing its reality is a key part of building trust and developing whole leaders. And whether it's small sacrifices or large ones, to become a whole and trusted leader and to build whole and sustaining trust in teams, each of us has to face the reality that personal sacrifices will be necessary. And some of the hardest ones will be even more important. And whether it's listening when you want to speak, or maybe speaking or leading when it would be easier for you to follow, or putting aside your own stubbornness for the sake of the learning that will be necessary to serve others better, sacrifice is a fundamental component of effective leadership and any trust building effort. So let's dig into what sacrificial leadership is all about. And for years, I taught a graduate level seminar that was focused on the foundations of faith and their impact on real people and on real leaders. And it was a class that allowed students to go deep on topics that were pretty complex and affecting them every day, but they didn't always think about every day. And every week, I asked them to write a paper on a question that most of us don't think about most days. And one of those questions was, does sacrifice have to hurt? And right now, you're probably grateful you weren't one of my doctoral students, or in my best world, you might be wishing you had been. I wasn't trying to intentionally provoke them or to bring them down or to twist their brains up, but I was attempting to bring them closer to one of the most basic tensions in our humanity and in leadership, the tension between self-sacrifice and self-preservation. And what I realized over the years and continue to experience is how difficult it is to think about sacrifice. We're more naturally pulled towards things that emphasize finding ourselves than in anything that might smell like it is about losing ourselves. And please don't hear me suggesting that things like self-awareness, identity, and self-conservation and self-preservation aren't important, because that's not what I mean at all. But also know that they don't represent a whole picture of what it means to be us, and especially what it means to be us together. And I know that's true because of how true it was for my students to consider personal sacrifices. And while my question of whether or not sacrifice has to hurt felt honest and inviting, I have to admit I was surprised at how many of them said no. So my first book was called Dying to Lead: Sacrificial Leadership in a Self-Centered World. And my point in writing that book was to go straight at the tension between self-sacrifice and self-preservation. And even the title was intended to highlight that tension. And from a leadership perspective, whether we are parents or presidents, I was inviting readers into the reality that so much of it is about wanting it and letting it go, like dying to lead and dying to lead. And to step up to do anything well requires a sense of ourselves and an accumulation of experiences and resources and confidence and a buildup of the things that are ours. Every accomplishment, every win, every failure, and even every dollar adds things to us that provide the foundation to accomplish incredible things. The difference between self preservation and self sacrifice is an awareness that our accomplishments add to us, but don't define us. And so the mission statement of the organization that I built, Wild Leaders, says our goal, our mission is to intentionally prepare a generation of courageous and sacrificial leaders who will lead the way in reflecting light into a world where darkness is the default. It's a controversial statement when you really think about it because it assumes a certain kind of universe. It assumes that to do anything worthwhile in our world is to consider the importance of both courage and sacrifice. And that without that consideration, we will default to a lack of awareness. And in the universe I aspire to live in, my sense of myself and my value is necessary. And I believe the same is true for you. But the story doesn't end there. Upon acceptance of my value, sacrifices will be necessary in my movement toward wholeness. Courageous and sacrificial leaders are those willing to go first in spite of their reluctance and fear, and willing to consider the greatest sacrifices they may be called or summoned to make, potentially paying that price without compensation or even without credit. And unless you've never been in a close relationship with another person, you understand sacrifice. Sacrificial leadership is not about a person giving up everything all the time and paying the price every single day, but it is about an honest consideration of the necessary personal costs of living in right relationship with others. And so often we have so little permission to consider the personal costs we may need to pay. Sacrifice is thrown around often, but rarely considered at a deeply personal level. And it's no wonder that my students struggled with the question of whether or not sacrifice had to hurt. If sacrifice has to hurt, and is also important for us to consider, who among us is going to step to the front of the sacrificial line? We've all heard parents who've said they will die for their children. And without dismissing how important that is, that statement from a parent, I'm not sure how interesting it is. As parents, we could say that all day long. But what would be interesting is whether or not we'd be willing to turn off our phone because our spouse or our children asked us to after noticing that our son was waiting to play catch in the front yard. Literally dying for our child might be easier. Can you imagine that? Than letting go of our inner selfishness that locks down when we are asked to do something simple like turning off our phone. And I've got a lot of fingers pointing back at me. So as I say that, know that I understand this. Leading sacrificially in full awareness of our own value and values and convictions requires us to consider the toughest things for us to put on that sacrificial altar. And without an awareness of those things we hold on to most tightly, like a real awareness that, yes, for most of us, like that whole phone example is so real. Like, you know what I'm talking about when you feel that lockdown. But without that awareness of those things, we risk a shallowness in our pursuit of wholeness that will lack depth, and our pursuit of being whole leaders that will lack depth and an entirely different impact in our world. Sacrificial leaders are those willing to consider the cost of leading in full awareness of their own value. And even more, they're willing to pay the necessary personal costs for those they are called to serve. So, how do you know what is sacred to you in your aspiration to become whole as a leader or as a person? How do you begin to understand what sacrifice looks like for you? And how does that relate to self-preservation? And here are a few ways to think about sacrifice in your own life and in your own work. There are 10 different things I want to offer to you. In any situation you're facing in your life or your work, what would be hardest to let go? Letting go of something secret or overtly sacred to you for the sake of something or someone other than yourself. So here are a few things to think about. 10 considerations when it comes to this concept of sacrifice and sacrificial leadership. Number one, it is painful to let go or to give. Sacrifice probably always involves a bit of pain. If you want to know whether or not you are over the target of your own sacrificial character development, think about the things that would be most difficult for you to completely surrender. And while you may not be called to surrender those things, you'll be one step closer to knowing what you hold on to most so tightly that it's strangling your capacity to be the person you long to be. And this will be different for every person. And for some of us, it might be to let go of resentment or even anger. It might be to let go of, to sacrifice the hurt that you feel entitled to feel in a relationship. It might be the hurt that you feel toward leaders or your leader or your manager. Or it might be resourcing. It doesn't have to be those kinds of feelings. It could be resourcing or a job or who knows what that is for you. But give yourself permission to see the thing that you hold on to most tightly. So number two, it often comes as nudges you likely ignore. Number two, let me say that again. It often comes as nudges you likely ignore. If you're like me, moments to let go and sacrifice something come almost daily. And sometimes it's the little things, whether it's our ego, how others will see us, our discomfort, or our obsession with comfort. We feel the nudges, but we often push them away. Those nudges on your heart might be telling you something, like a good friend gently elbowing you or kicking your leg under the table when you've been inappropriate or out of line. Those nudges are easier to push away than to let sink in. Number three, you feel some reluctance to offer it. We are all addicted to something. Our best measure of our willingness to sacrifice something is how we respond when someone points it out or asks us to let it go. I once heard it said that if you want to know what kind of servant you are, just take a look at how you respond when someone treats you like one. Reluctance to let go of something is not the problem sometimes. The problem is a lack of awareness of the personal costs we may have to pay. And so it can be important to think about that you feel some reluctance to offer it. Maybe there's something there to pay attention to. Number four, sacrifices are often unlikely and even surprising. Unlikely and even surprising. A surface level approach to sacrifice would be to suggest that sacrificial character and behaviors, it's all about giving other people what they want and surrendering our tendency to only focus on what is best for us. And while that may be the case sometimes, and for some of us, a more whole perspective on sacrificial character is a truly honest assessment of what we hold on to most closely. And for some of us, it's a list. It's a list of us. It's a list of usual suspects like pride, money, status, and comparison. But for others, peacekeeping or compulsion to fix others, and even speaking up and using their voice is a surprising sacrifice. We spend so little time thinking about the real potential cost to us, it's likely to be a little surprising. So, unless you are incredibly thoughtful, most of us don't consider the daily costs we may need to pay to serve others in our world. Number five, the economics of sacrifice do not make sense. The economics of sacrifice do not make sense. In a universe defined in part by the tension between our own value and our necessary sacrifices, getting something in return or even paying it forward is not the goal. Certainly, there are benefits of sacrificial behaviors and leadership. There are benefits that we can't ignore that we may receive upon doing something sacrificial or even acting with humility. But when we do those things in service of selfish motives, we lose the power and intent of what sacrificial leadership is all about. There is no supply and demand, just the consideration of necessary sacrifices. And our world is based on an economy of compensation. I'll do this for you if you do this for me. In a sacrificial and more whole reality, I do this for you. Number six, sacrifice is selfless in its motive after consideration of the selfish alternative. We aren't fully prepared for an honest consideration of our potential sacrifices until we are ready to consider the opposite. You must be in a place where you are ready to consider your selfishness to understand selflessness. And that's hard. And that's hard to do, but it is okay. We have to be able to consider the other side in order to understand what sacrifice is about. Number 7, sacrifice is customized to the person, just like courage and fear. It is customized to the person. We have different things that are sacrificial to each of us. That's the bespoke story. That is your wild story. When we generalize something like sacrificial leadership or servant leadership to a list of common characteristics or behaviors, we miss the real conversation happening inside of each individual. And similar to the points I made in number 4, what is painful for me to consider letting go may be very different from what's on your list. And even the nuance within a potential sacrifice gets interesting. As an example, for many of us, giving away our financial resources generously is hard to consider. But the reasons behind that hesitancy may look very different for you and for me. This is surprising, but sacrifice for one is not sacrifice for another necessarily. Number 8, sacrifice requires a sense of self to fully understand sacrifice. You can't sacrifice something you don't have yet. But the reality is that most of us already have something if we were to stop to see it. And so it does require a sense of ourselves. Like we build value, and then there's something that's invaluable in that's the sacrifice. So it requires that. Number 9, sacrifice involves a surrendering of your power to change it, your control, but it cannot be forced. This one's got some depth, right? It involves a surrendering of your power to change it. Sacrificial character, let me break this down, is invited and not prescribed. The release of the power to control the outcomes of our lives and our work is not something that someone else has the power to force. Forcing the sacrifice isn't sacrifice. That's force. The normative message we hear is that control and power is something to hold, unless, of course, we are blaming others for the power they have, which is also occurring in our global narrative. Sacrificial leadership isn't something we command others to adopt, but something we invite them to consider. And in that way, someone has to be ready for the consideration in that consideration in their life. And readiness is invited and not prescribed, just like sacrifice. It's one of the reasons that in premarital counseling, I've always asked the couple, I've done this a few times, the couple to consider those things that will be most challenging for them to sacrifice for the other. And by the way, there is a difference between something being taken away and something being offered. A sacrificial character is a character willing to offer that which we hold most tightly.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
And then number 10, sacrifice. This is a big one. Wow. When it comes to building trust, when it comes to building effective leadership and just being effective in our lives and our whole lives. Number 10, sacrifice is inherently relational between you and another. Between you and another. Sacrificial behaviors only get interesting in the context of our relationship to the will of another. That's what makes life so challenging and so incredibly interesting. And oftentimes, the closer we are, the further we are from doing the sacrificial thing. Why is it that we are least kind to those closest to us? Why does that occur? We'll comfort a friend or even a stranger, but would we offer that same comfort to a family member we are living with every day? Or someone we work with and know very well every day? The most surprising and powerful sacrificial behaviors are often toward those that are on the outside. would be perceived as those would be perceived as easy sacrifices. Equally interesting is how we show up in professional situations. In those situations, it's less about our resistance to change and more about the appropriateness of personal conversations about sacrifice. When was the last time that someone apologized to you at work without qualification? Wouldn't that be amazing if we had places where people were apologizing to each other? Not because it's like everybody's feeling wrong all the time, but because we need to do that once in a while. And unfortunately, those kinds of sacrificial moments, times where someone lets go and says they're sorry, are too rare. But just imagine if they weren't. It's like an extension of gratitude. Gratitude's one thing. Another level of that would be actually saying, I'm sorry. Because, like I said, sacrifice is inherently a relational thing. Sacrificial leadership isn't about laying it all down all the time. I want to be really clear about that. But in full light of your value and the courage and conviction that has been wired into you to thoughtfully and honestly consider what sacrifices may be necessary for you to best serve those around you. Every day we are confronted in moments with opportunity to self-preserve and to lock down or to honestly humble ourselves and say it's all about us into considering what we might need to let go. That's the difference. The common factor is our willingness to put our own desires or outcomes aside for the sake of others in our influence. Whether it's in your family, with your friends, as a leader, on your team in the workplace, what difference would it make if you were willing to consider the personal sacrifices you might be called to make? What would change for you and for others? It's one of the things that I've always said about leaders is I think that it would be a really important question. I wish we asked this of every person who goes into a leadership role is, what are the things that you might have to sacrifice if you were to take this job? What are the things that are going to be most challenging for you to put aside to take this job? What is it that causes you to be reluctant to take this job? If someone can't identify, if it's any leadership role and they can't identify those things, do we really want to bring them in to lead? Because there are going to be costs. There's going to be things they'll discover that are important to pay attention to. So we have moments to practice sacrificial behaviors and presence every day. It's not about giving everything up all the time, but considering what you hold on to most tightly. For a student, it might be as simple as speaking up in class or reminding yourself that you speaking up might help another student do the same, or even help your professor a bit. For others, the sacrifice might be to shut up and stop talking and filling all the space in every conversation and actively avoiding turning a story from someone else into your story. And by the way, it's one thing to sit with someone else in their pain and sometimes not as helpful to relate to them by telling your story. Sometimes we just need someone to say they understand and not launch into their own thing. And sometimes it does give us something to relate to. For others, a small sacrifice might be asking someone their name after they've already told you. It sounds silly, but it's a little sacrifice, right? Sacrificing that discomfort you might want to feel to be comfortable. And for some leaders, it might mean sharing something you are still learning and have not answered yet. That is such a powerful thing when a leader does that. Just shares the thing that they are continuing to learn in a world that tells them that they're supposed to have it all figured out when they know they don't. Understanding what we are holding on to most tightly is the start. A trusted leader understands that both sacrifice and moments of self-preservation are necessary. We trust them because they don't lock down on one side or the other. They remain open to the reality that times may call for them to choose something that feels selfish, or they may call for a tremendous sacrifice. And we trust that person because they see the choice. And here's a couple, if you want some questions, maybe for a conversation, these are interesting questions. I don't know about the dinner table within your team. One question would be, what do you hold on to most tightly? What do you hold on to most tightly? Number two, what personal sacrifice, if you were willing to make it, could restore a relationship with someone else in your life or in your work? Number three, what would be the greatest sacrifice you might be called to consider in each of the contexts of these contexts, your work, your family, or maybe your friendships? Number four, if you picked one of the categories from the above that I just mentioned and made the sacrifice, what would be different? Work, relationship, maybe your family or marriage and friendships. And then five, How would you encourage or invite someone else to consider their own personal sacrifices for the sake of others? And as always, I hope that you'll have a wild conversation.
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.